Hi, welcome to Bookmark. I'm your host, Don Noble. Today's guest is writer Darnell Arnoult. Arnoult is the author of a novel, Sufficient Grace, and 2 volumes of poetry, What Travels With Us and Galaxy Wagon. I spoke with Darnell Arnoult at Gorham's Bluff Lodge as a part of the annual celebration of Southern literature at Northeast Alabama Community College. Darnell, it's nice to see you again.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be back.
The last time you and I sat down to talk, we were in Jacksonville, Alabama, at Jacksonville State, and we were talking about a novel of yours, which was at the time your first novel, Sufficient Grace.
That's right.
Since then, you may have had did you have a volume of poetry even then?
I did. The first volume of poetry
Right.
came out about 6 months before the novel.
Right, and I don't think we talked about it at all. And since then, you have another volume of poetry, and both of them with LSU Press, which is, I think, just about as good as it can get.
I'm blessed. I'm blessed with LSU Press.
They have good writers, and they do a good job with the books. But we're here. The subject of this weekend is, for you especially, Appalachian literature. So you are, whether you like it or not, now an Appalachian poet.
I don't mind that.
No, and you're a Virginian, and you're working in Tennessee, and that's, it all makes sense. What can you do about life in Appalachia in poetry that maybe you couldn't necessarily do in fiction?
Well, I think some stories lend themselves to poetry, and I teach a lot of adults as well as undergraduates, and sometimes it's easier for them to approach their stories through poetry, even narrative poetry. The short story, the novel can be overwhelming, and so for me, my form of activism is community writing. I go out in the community, I teach free workshops, I teach adults how to tell their stories, to give voice to their stories. And in Appalachia, voice is complicated, it's complex. Because when you move outside of Appalachia, people will say, oh, they don't talk like that anymore. You can't write a story like that. You can't write a poem like that. And I think poetry allows them to tell a physical story that has so much subtext underneath it.
So I have heard this from time to time. When you're teaching school children, 7th grade, 10th grade, doesn't matter, and you say the word poetry, they don't want to hear it.
Right.
They want to read a story. But when it comes to teaching people to write, adults to write, they're more likely to be happy writing a poem than they are to write fiction.
Well, and there are a lot of...
How does that change around like that?
Well, there are a lot of poems that are stories, and with Appalachia, a lot of the poetry is narrative poetry, and somebody may read a poem and not understand all of the artifice that's present on the page, because my goal is always for the poem to sound like somebody just said it, even though there's lots of poetic device there present if you know what to look for. And when I teach poetry and when I write poetry, the first thing I want to think about is what story am I telling in this poem, and what moment does the poem reveal that's so telling. I think it was Eudora Welty who said that she kept her subject in the camera until suddenly they looked at the lens and opened up and revealed themselves. And so when we're looking at poems, I'm waiting for that moment in the poem, and I try to encourage my students to write until that moment shows itself, and then you build a poem, rebuild the poem based on that.
And how old are they, these students?
Well, I teach undergraduates at Lincoln Memorial University in Harrogate, Tennessee, and I teach a lot of adult workshops in my living room, at a winery in Sweetwater. I've taught in a conference room. I demystify poetry and fiction writing for a lot of people who are afraid to go to MFA programs and afraid to go to college and study writing.
And I'll bet that what I'm about to say is true. I'll bet Lee Smith has something to do with all that, because she really set the model years ago for going out in the community and teaching adults
Well,
writing. And she taught you too, didn't she?
she did. She was my mentor as an undergraduate. She also had some influence on me in graduate school. She's one of my dearest friends, and I still go to her for advice about teaching. But she was one of those people who, in the classroom, figured out what the student was trying to do and then threw lots of things at them to nurture them as a writer. So you didn't come out of Lee's class necessarily writing like Lee, which happens a lot of times in writing classes. That's the goal of the instructor. Lee really helped you find your individual voice, and that's how I learned to teach. And that's what I try to do when I teach, whether I'm teaching poetry or fiction. It's what do you have to say, and who can I give you that's going to help you build a stronger voice? Who can I give you to read?
Who's the right person to read?
Right.
Now, you said your form of activism might be helping Appalachian people find their voice. There's a lot of other kinds of activism going on up there, though.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
What do you make of what in poetry? You have two different movements going on. In Alabama, we have a bunch of poets who self-identify as eco-poets. And in Appalachia, you must have a good deal of protest poetry about mining and mountaintop removal. And then you have the black Appalachian poets.
Right, the Appalachian poets. And that was...
What are they doing?
Well, first of all, there's this misnomer that Appalachia is white, through and through. Now, there are pockets of whiteness, and I live in one of them right now. But there's also a large Appalachian population that are African American or Latino, and Frank X. Walker is a really well-known African American poet who is from Appalachia, and he and some other people got this developed this identity of the Appalachian writer. Crystal Wilkinson has been associated with that movement, and a lot of wonderful poetry has been, brought to the public through the curiosity of people wondering what an Appalachian poet is,
Well,
and Frank is such a great performer of poetry as well. And Crystal Wilkinson has written some amazing poetry, although right now I think she's mostly published fiction, but she's also an incredible poet. So that movement is afoot. And then there's so many people right now writing about mountaintop removal. There's so many people worked up over the book Hillbilly Elegy, and they're responding to Appalachian identity and who voted for who, and how somebody who isn't from Appalachia maybe shouldn't be writing about that. And so a lot of that is coming out in contemporary poetry in Appalachia right now. And then there is a lot of poetry that's about the appreciation of the environment in Appalachia, not just the destruction of it, which is a big issue, but also the beauty itself.
How beautiful it is.
How gorgeous a place it is.
Well, you have poems that are nature poems. I mean, you're not the Wordsworth of Kentucky or anything, but you have nature poems and family poems.
Nature and family. And actually, my knowledge of nature has increased dramatically since I married my husband. He is a trail rider, or was a trail rider, and now his back is too bad to ride horses. But he took me out in the woods and taught me a whole lot about nature that I'd sort of seen at a distance. And my grandmother had me in the garden. I'd go collect walnuts, but he knows the name of everything, and it's a joy to go in the woods with him.
And you have a poem about your husband and horses.
I do.
I'd love to hear it.
Okay, let me find this poem. I folded it down so I could find it easy, but that's always the thing. All right, so this is a poem about me riding behind my husband. He rode a very large breeding stock paint, which is essentially a quarter horse, but he would have been a nose guard on a horse football team. And I was always behind his butt going up a hill or going down a hill, so that's where this comes from, trail. Bubba is often mistaken for a draft horse, his fanny as broad as the washerwoman's at the end of Yellow Jacket Cove. I trail his chestnut rump up one sharp steep after another. He sways and springs forward and up slow, as if he totes a heavy load of wet sheets and towels. Watch him walk with steady step. See him push his sleek-barreled body on fragile toothpick legs, his steel shoes slapping dirt and rock toward top, steady as a ringer washer slapping time against water, its momentum getting the job done. So
He's big. I'm myself very timid about horses. They seem very large to me.
they are. They're a couple thousand pounds,
Yeah.
you know.
A lot of Appalachian literature, just the things we've been talking about in the last couple of minutes, some of it is insistent, some of it is cultural, some of it is angry, the spoiling of nature and so on. But there is humor in it. And reading through your new book of poetry, there was one poem in particular, and also all of us, you and I and everybody else who admits it, is getting older. And you have a poem which I found which really tickled me. I found it very funny, on searching for something that you've lost. I won't say what it is because it takes halfway through the poem for the reader to get to it. Okay. The title of the poem is what?
Hiding.
Hiding, yes. Read that for us, would you?
All right. Don't make me come looking for you. Don't make me have to comb the house, the car, the truck, the tractor, the back of the toilet, the garage, the shed, the pile of papers at the kitchen counter. Where else could you be? The crappy space beneath the couch cushions, where you've probably latched onto something old and sticky, down inside the workings of the recliner, where God knows some mouse is nesting, thinking of having babies. I know you're watching me like so many owls' eyes, laughing from your comfortable perches while I search high and low, inside and out. Sure, chuckle as I move this and that, swipe my fingers across the dust I can't really see anymore without you. Amuse yourselves while I stretch my arms out as far as they'll go, trying to read the blessed phone book. How can you be so cruel? To wait patiently in your hidey holes, watching the panic climb out my collar and frustration cloud my memory all the more. I've paid plenty for each of you, but not so much you can afford to be coy, mean, mischievous. You aren't prescription, you know. You're not official. Your elitist attitude is only as good as what I put in front of you under a good light. So come out wherever you are. For pity's sake, make yourself useful. Or I'll drive, something I can still do without you sons of bitches, to Dollar General and lay down another Abraham Lincoln, because you need to learn that anything, I mean anything, can be replaced.
Only people who are semi-blind understand that you cannot look for your glasses unless you have your glasses on.
Exactly. And 9 times out of 10, they're on top of your head and you don't know it.
Not mine.
So.
I know mine are either on my eyes or they don't exist. It is a poem, in a sense, about aging. And poets of an age, you have poems, clearly poems that look backwards, poems that look forward, poems about the past and your parents and grandparents, and poems about your children. Mm-hmm. What do you do in there?
Well, it's interesting. This book, I didn't start writing this book with the book in mind. I just was writing poems. It's the only thing I had time to write. I didn't really have time to write fiction. And poems seemed to fit around the cracks and corners of my life. And at one point, I was working on a book of poems about Mary Todd Lincoln, and I went through my thumb drive getting those poems together, and in the process I discovered that all these other poems had language in common. There were certain words that got repeated, there were certain ideas that got repeated, and somehow family was intrinsic in the poems. My love story with my husband, a middle life romance, was intrinsic, becoming a grandmother, all that at the same time. And I realized that there was a story there. It was a story of middle age and what got you there and what you were looking at, what was ahead of you that you hadn't really looked that closely at before. And And a lot of it hinges on my father, because my father was a storyteller, and he also was a really talented man who was an alcoholic and didn't really fully realize his potential. And then there's the influence of my mother, who was a storyteller and schizophrenic at a later age. And then my husband, who is a wonderful storyteller and grew up in Appalachia, went away to college when he was 14, brilliant man, who came back to the Appalachia from a busy engineering life. And my grandchildren, the fact that they were learning to read, that they were becoming storytellers, it just all kind of came together.
Isn't it funny? One always asks writers why they switch genres, why they quit writing fiction and start writing poetry, or vice versa. And I remember asking Daniel Wallace years ago why his first book or two, the chapters were so short. And he knew, everybody asked him because they were really small
Right,
chapters.
I remember. I love that book.
And he was doing them while his baby son napped. And he only had 20 minutes at a time, so the chapters turned out to be very short. And in your case, you had additional responsibilities at Liberty.
Mm-hmm. At Lincoln Memorial.
Lincoln Memorial, not Liberty, Lincoln Memorial. And so there wasn't time to write a novel, but there was time to do poems.
There was time to write poems. And actually, the first poetry book came about because I was a single mother, and I didn't have time to write fiction. I really started out being a fiction writer, and that's my first love. But as my children got older and I didn't have to pick them up at school and get them to practice, that their ball practice was at school, then I would return to the short story. Mm-hmm. And then when they went away to school, I finally wrote a novel. And then I was back to poetry because of administrative responsibilities.
So this is not ordained by the gods. It has to do with how many minutes in a row you're free to do it.
Right. And women constantly have to reinvent themselves. And as writers, we have to reinvent ourselves based on the time we have available.
Is it your father's storytelling that energizes the guerrilla poem?
The guerrilla poem is a story that I learned to tell when I was 4 years old.
Well, let's hear it.
All
Let's
right.
hear the guerrilla poem.
All right. The guerrilla story. Around 10, the phone rang. We were all in bed. I was 2. Joe, he heard the voice slur. There's a fellow with a gorilla down here. Says he'll pay $100 to anybody who goes 5 minutes with his monkey and walks out under his own steam. Daddy said, "Where is he?" into the black receiver, heavy enough itself to be a weapon. Between bed and the bazaar, he drank a fifth of liquor and still had to pay 50 cents more to be foolish. Daddy wore a coat and tie when he wasn't playing golf, even to fight gorillas. The gorilla caught him by the necktie, dragged him through peanut hulls, banana peels, slides of excrement, then tossed Daddy to the back of the cage and rattled the bars to scare onlookers and earn his pay. But Daddy came to and leaped onto the gorilla's back and grabbed the bars just beyond all that hair and muscle, pinned him to his own cage. Daddy held on until he walked out under his own steam, held out his hand for the 100, but the carny wasn't having it. "You had an illegal hold on my gorilla," the man barked. "How," my daddy said, "from that night until the day he died, can a man have an illegal hold on something with 4 hands? 40 years later, I met a boxing chimpanzee named Congo, a champion in '57. He'd retired to Tarpon Springs. Someone wrote a book about him, The Gorilla Show. I have this poem. He outlived Daddy by at least 20 years. Congo never talked about that night in Martinsville, ashamed to have been beaten, not even to me. My daddy, on the other hand, won years of telling this story. He taught me to tell it, that it's a story worth believing, even with no proof but the story itself."
How can you have an illegal hold on a gorilla?
Well, that was his big question. That was his big question.
Totally agree. We have a few minutes left, and I normally ask people, and it's particularly relevant, it seems, here. Poetry, novel, poetry, and now, what are you working on?
I always have several projects going because I have ADHD. But right now I'm focused on another novel. And it's a novel I started some years ago. And I'm really excited about it. I love the characters. It's set in the 60s and in a little community by settled out carnival workers. And
More gorillas.
No gorillas right now, but there's a knife thrower and sword swallower who's become the barber because he likes sharp things.
Uh-huh.
And there's a young boy whose father is missing, and he and his mother come to this town looking for him. And it's really about the boys coming of age and the way we reinvent ourselves and discover our own mythology.
Yep.
I'm really excited about it.
Your poems look forward and backward. The title of the new book, Galaxy Wagon, the cover, which we will show, is the automobile, and then above the automobile, the galaxy. And
galaxy.
Of course, it's a pun. Is it a pun?
Well, I mean, it's the Galaxy station wagon
Yeah.
figures very highly in the final poem
Right.
and also in my childhood. And I'm a really bad speller. And so a lot of people think that I just misspelled galaxy. But back in the day, Ford spelled galaxy with an IE.
Yes.
Now they don't. They've corrected their spelling.
Really?
But I didn't misspell the title. It's intentional. It's really, it's about what might be ahead of us and what's behind us.
Let's close with that.
All right.
It's the last poem in your newest book.
Galaxy Wagon. Out of the winding ribbon of unfiltered Chesterfields, burning and floating in switchbacks through the pitch black lies that everything will be all right, Perry Como croons, "Dream on, little dreamer, dream on and on." The red-orange needle stitches the thin light box seam of AM across the center dash, and the road unspools another ribbon or a song or a dream before my father's sure hands. The big steering wheel rocks a song or a dream or a haunting of Chesterfields glowing their starry tips, one after another, and Perry Como's honeyed voice slips out like a ghost through the wing windows with all we believed we might reach.
But don't reach.
Well, maybe. We can't reach it all. We can't reach it all.
You got a station wagon, you have cigarettes, you have Perry Como. It does take a person back. Darnell, thank you very much.
Thank you for having
I'm
me.
so glad you could be here today.
Well, I always enjoy seeing you.
It was a pleasure.